Scorn is one of the most visually distinctive games I've played. In part inspired by the work of the artist H.R. Giger, Scorn's environments marry mechanical intricacy with biology to create a highly unnerving experience. It's sci-fi but not high-tech, with analog mechanics, skeletal metalwork, and the occasional glimpse of something truly alive. On the surface, Scorn does look like a first-person shooter, but it really has more in common with Myst or The Witness than Doom. This is a slow-paced, brooding title that requires puzzle solving and careful exploration. It's a one-of-a-kind experience that satisfies a certain itch that no other software truly can. But with a small team at the helm and a nearly 10-year development cycle, is this Unreal Engine 4 based game properly polished? And what exactly is going on with image reconstruction? Scorn's visual design is pitch perfect from the moment you look at the title screen. The environments are highly ambiguous, vaguely mechanical, but ribbed with bone-like arches and inlaid with vascular tubing. Everything is dilapidated, worn, and glistening with moisture, but some mechanisms still seem to work and hint at some larger unknown purpose. As you progress, the organic elements take over, with guts and veins splayed out all around. Humanoid creatures can be found, discarded like trash or fused into bizarre arrangements. And your character is no different. Shortly into the game, you're attacked by a parasite, which slowly envelops you. The game's style is strange, uncomfortable, and wholly unique in gaming. Expect to see unique and breathtaking artwork for every location in the game. Decaying ceilings with light flooding in, elaborate contraptions surrounded in mist, a temple crisscrossed by webs of flesh. It's all eye-catching and visually compelling. So much care and attention to detail has been packed into every space. All that artwork would be for naught if the technology wasn't there to back it up, of course. Scorn benefits a lot from its restricted scope and reliance on static opaque models to really ramp up the overall level of fidelity. There's a ton of geometry carved into every surface, for instance. The level of consistency is really something here, particularly for a smaller budget game. Maps are ornate and detail-rich in a way that few other games can match. The indirect lighting is very high quality as well. It seems like we're getting pre-computed GI here, but it looks accurate and presents without too many inconsistencies. Scorn's environmental designs really lend themselves to baked lighting techniques, given their heavy dependence on indirect illumination, fixed light positions, and limited use of dynamic objects. There are plenty of nice little technical touches as well. Screen space shadows are used in lieu of shadow maps on certain bits of geometry, mostly for small protrusions at acute lighting angles where the shadow map resolve would become rather poor. The game features full body awareness of your character, a rarity these days, which adds to the immersion. Plus, there's a ton of fog and mist in the game, including plenty of low-lying volumetric fog that is applied liberally throughout many levels. But that's not to say that everything is perfect. For starters, even though Scorn is a current-gen exclusive, released on Series S, Series X, and PC, the overall visual impression is definitely of a last-gen game, albeit an excellent-looking one. Don't expect anything in the way of boundary-pushing rendering features like ray tracing. And while the environments do look very dense at reasonable distances, at point-blank range you can see the limitations of traditional geometry meshes, especially those that were designed around the constraints of older hardware platforms. Plus, there are some pretty obvious issues with physically based materials at times, specifically their specular lighting properties. Scorn showcases a lot of wet, shiny materials, so a lot of the models in the game exhibit strong specular. This does work alright for the most part, but there are many spots, especially in crevices or in ceilings, where you can see some really bright specular lighting, even in the absence of a corresponding light source. Scorn has some very dense environmental meshes, which tends to highlight this effect a little bit. Specular reflectivity should have been toned down in a lot of places, I think, to help control this visual issue. But on the whole, the game still looks excellent. Scorn combines beautiful art, detailed models, and a skilled use of Unreal Engine 4 to achieve an engrossing visual aesthetic. Let's move on to image quality and performance. Resolution metrics are actually pretty simple on the surface. Series S renders at 1080p internally, while Series X hits 1440p. I tested across a variety of scenes and couldn't find evidence of lower pixel counts, though dynamic resolution is a possibility. But when I started to examine the frames more closely, I noticed a handful of oddities, factors that suggest the use of some truly cutting-edge technology. The first most obvious clue is the difference in resolve detail between the two machines. While Series S seems very 1080p-like, Series X has an overall resolve that looks strikingly similar to 4K, even at very close viewing distances. If we bring in the PC version with maxed out settings at a full 4K resolution, the image resolve in still scenes looks nearly identical. This suggests some sort of temporal upsampling is in effect on Series X, but what kind of temporal upsampling could it be? The second clue came down to the resolve of certain alpha particles on Series X. Look closely here. The alpha particles on Series X exhibit small, artifact-ridden trails when they move. But on Series S, the alpha particles resolve normally without any ghosting or artifacting. The issue here is that these elements don't have motion vectors, so certain temporal AA techniques can struggle with them at times. One potential upsampling method in particular is known for these sorts of artifacts, and that's AMD's Fidelity Super Resolution 2, aka FSR 2. Indeed, when we compare the maxed out PC version running with FSR 2 quality at 4K output to the Series X release, the image resolve looks just about identical. The alpha exhibits the same artifacting for one, and the level of clarity and sharpness is very similar. A battery of image quality tests come up with similar results. Walking forward in this scene produces matching aliasing, for instance. If we spin the camera rapidly next to a highlighted item, you can observe identical seeming artifacts on the highlights the game is trying to resolve, with a grainy, stippled pattern. The stereotypical FSR 2 image quality flaw, significant disocclusion artifacting, is much harder to observe here on Series X, however. Typically, FSR 2 presents with a sort of fizzling artifact pattern when certain screen elements are uncovered, like during this animation sequence on the PC version of God of War. There is some disocclusion artifacting on the Xbox Series X, but it tends to be pretty mild and not easily noticed. I do think that there are a few key factors that make disocclusion less of an issue in this particular game though. Scorn has a first-person perspective without complex animation, a low-contrast visual style, and a lot of filmed grain, which cannot be turned off. And when we take the PC version at FSR 2 quality and stack it up against the Series X here, the disocclusion artifacting does appear more or less identical, and quite unlike Unreal's TAA, which tends to have more ghosting. So ultimately, I did think that the Series X version of this game was using FSR 2 to reconstruct a full resolution 4K image. There were a handful of other clues as well, like the fact that the PC version of the game only supports FSR 2 as an upsampling method and not Unreal's TAAU or PC-specific techniques like DLSS or XESS. And shortly after I finished this video, we received direct confirmation from the game's developer that FSR 2 is indeed in use on Xbox Series X. So FSR 2 is definitely here. As for Series S, that looks like a 1080p render with TAA, without any obvious upsampling tech. If we rope in the PC version again at max settings with TAA at 1080p, the overall image resolve looks very similar. The use of FSR 2 is very significant, as this is to our knowledge the first deployment of FSR 2 in a console title. While there hasn't really been any technical barrier precluding developers from using FSR 2 in console games since its release several months ago, game development timelines have seemed to preclude its immediate integration into console software. Techniques like FSR 2 and Unreal's own TSR improve image quality while lowering rendering load. But unlike past upsampling technologies, they aim to bring images as low as quarter resolution to a full res resolve, like 1080p to 4K. Upsampling by this magnitude allows for the deployment of sophisticated graphics tech in future console software, like multiple ray tracing techniques, without a corresponding image quality sacrifice. The likely application of FSR 2 here is more conservative than that, with a lower upscale factor, but the 4K-like image it produces on Series X still impresses. So how does performance hold up across the consoles? Series S offers a virtually locked 60 FPS update throughout the run of play. Combat, cutscenes, exploration, it all runs without issue. I did notice that the Series S would occasionally drop a single frame during traversal in more demanding environments, but this wasn't a common issue and wasn't particularly noticeable. Series X is largely the same, a mostly solid 60 FPS with the odd duplicate frame, but there are a few areas where the game suffers from more serious framerate issues. The game's cutscenes can suffer from significant performance drops, including the opening sequence, which dips as low as 43 FPS. Combat can sometimes provoke a momentary framerate drop, particularly when alpha effects are on screen. Lastly, there are a few instances where the environment itself was complex enough to cause a prolonged performance issue. It is important, however, to stress that the Series X is at 60 FPS the overwhelming majority of the time, but these performance issues are curious. I say that because the Series X typically delivers a much larger resolution advantage over Series S than what we're seeing here. 1080p to 1440p is just a 78% improvement in raw pixel count, while 1080p to 4K or 1080p to 1800p is a more common divide in typical resolution between the two machines. There's no readily apparent difference in other visual settings between the consoles either, so what's going on? Well, upsampling techniques do have a frame time cost, and more advanced methods take more time to compute. FSR 2 can be particularly expensive, and it's possible that it could take several milliseconds to compute per 4K frame on the Series X. Within a 16.7 millisecond frame time budget, that's a pretty big chunk of time, which could explain why Series X falls behind Series S in performance despite only a moderate uptick in raw pixel count. It also hints at why we aren't seeing similar upsampling tech on the S. The computational cost may simply be too large. Scorn isn't for everyone. It's cryptic, slow-paced, and very hard. You're dumped into a world without any instruction and expected to figure out how to progress with little in the way of clues. It bears some similarity to old-school adventure games and is deliberately obtuse in much the same way. Plus, there's no text, no dialogue, and a nearly non-existent plot. It's a great fit for Game Pass, as Scorn is a game that's well worth trying, but I suspect many players won't have the drive to progress very far. It's going to take a certain kind of gamer to really savor what this game has to offer, but those players will find a lot of visual rewards awaiting them. Scorn delivers a dense, beautifully designed world that often looks remarkable. Performance is mostly excellent as well, delivering a stable 60 FPS with only minor hitches. And Scorn provides an insight into how advanced upsampling techniques, like FSR 2, may ultimately fare on current-gen consoles. There are big image quality boosts, but they seem to come with a substantial frame time penalty, particularly when aiming for higher frame rates. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content, and to get in touch, just use Twitter. Thanks for watching.